June 12th, 1962. Worthington, Minnesota. 20-year-old Marlys Gross gives birth to a baby daughter named Mary Agnes, but is told by the hospital staff that the child did not survive. Mary Agnes is given a funeral and buried in a grave, but months later, Marlys is mailed a photograph of a family holding a baby whom she believes is her daughter. After discovering a number of suspicious discrepancies, Marlys petitions to have some bone fragments exhumed from Mary Agnes's grave in 1996, and DNA testing reveals that the remains do not belong to her. Marlys suspects that her child was stolen and sold at an illegal black market adoption, but no one knows what actually happened to Mary Agnes. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today we're going to be exploring one of the most bizarre mysteries we've ever covered, the 1962 disappearance of Mary Agnes Gross. Well, maybe we'll call this a possible disappearance. What's truly unique about this case is that Mary Agnes was a newborn baby who supposedly died shortly after her mother gave birth to her, but it's possible that might have been a completely fabricated cover story. This was featured on Unsolved Mysteries as a Lost Love segment, which generally aren't the subject of Trail Went Cold episodes, but the circumstances of this story are just so odd that I'll make an exception. I actually do not remember ever seeing the Unsolved Mysteries segment on television, so when it was uploaded to Amazon Prime a few years ago, and I finally got to watch it, I was taken by complete surprise. After Mary Agnes's death, she was buried in a grave at a local cemetery, which was periodically visited by her mother Marlys over the next 3 decades, but things took a surprising turn when Marlys suddenly showed up one day and saw a headstone with the name Pamela Ray Dickey over her daughter's burial plot. It turned out that Pamela Ray Dickey was a completely different deceased child who died shortly after being born in the exact same hospital on the exact same date as Mary Agnes. Marlys started believing that some sort of cover-up had been orchestrated by the hospital and that her daughter might still be alive somewhere, so she managed to exhume Mary Agnes's remains, and DNA testing would prove they did not belong to her. The prevalent theory is that Mary Agnes was taken away from her mother and sold to another family in a black market adoption, prompting the hospital to orchestrate a cover-up in order to give Marlys the false impression that her child was dead. If not, then this whole mystery might be the result of a disastrous series of mistakes and clerical errors. Either way, there is a possibility that Mary Agnes might still be alive somewhere today under a different identity, and while the story is quite a jigsaw puzzle, I'm at least going to make an attempt to put the pieces together on today's episode. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now explore the bizarre saga of Mary Agnes Gross. Our story begins in Minnesota in 1962, and one of our central figures is 20-year-old Marlys Gross, who is on the verge of giving birth to her first child. Marlys was married to the child's father, Leighton Gross, but when she was 7 months pregnant, she decided to separate from her husband and move in with her mother, Clara Zaraf, in the small town of Bigelow. Even though her marriage has come to an end, Marlys is still planning to raise her child as a single mother, and if the baby turns out to be a girl, she will be named Mary Agnes. On June the 12th, Marlys went into labor and traveled to the nearby town of Worthington in order to give birth at Worthington Regional Hospital. She was put under heavy anesthesia for the delivery and would later recall having vague images of seeing her newborn baby moving around her little feet while being examined by her pediatrician, Dr. John Stam. Marlys soon fell asleep, but when she woke up, Dr. Stam appeared at her bedside and told her she had given birth to a daughter, Mary Agnes, but he also had some terrible news. The child was now dead. According to Dr. Stam, Mary Agnes had lived for an hour after her birth before she passed away, though he would not provide any details about her exact cause of death. Shortly thereafter, Marlys was wheeled out of the delivery room into the hallway and wound up passing by a bassinet, which she believed contained Mary Agnes's body. When Marlys begged to see her, the staff reluctantly let her take a look for around 10 to 15 seconds. Marlys would later say that Mary Agnes looked like she was still sound asleep and did not appear to be dead, as her skin did not have the purple color that stillborn babies normally have. Regardless, this would turn out to be the only time Marlys was allowed to see her daughter, and the hospital would not allow her to take photographs of Mary Agnes's body. Marlys would later ask F.L. Shada, the doctor who delivered Mary Agnes, if an autopsy could be performed in order to get a better idea of how she died. Shada told her that it was too late to do this because the funeral home had already picked up Mary Agnes's body and embalmed it. Mary Agnes's funeral would be held at the Benson Funeral Home the following day, but Marlys was unable to attend since she was still recovering in the hospital. Her mother Clara and Marlys's best friend, Judy Voges, wound up going to the funeral home instead and viewed Mary Agnes's body in her casket. Oddly, Judy would describe the child she saw as having sparse, light-colored hair, but when Marlys saw Mary Agnes in the bassinet the previous day, she remembered her having a full head of dark brown hair. Marlys also noticed marks on Mary Agnes's forehead from the doctor having used forceps during the delivery, but Judy claimed that the child in the casket did not have these marks. The funeral director also told Clara that she was not allowed to take any photographs of Mary Agnes's body, though she was able to take a few pictures of the closed casket right before it was buried in a grave at St. Mary's Cemetery. When Mary Agnes was laid to rest, Clara claimed that she saw another family standing near the gravesite who were crying and seemed very emotional about the situation, but Clara did not recognize them. 1 week later, Marlys was finally released from the hospital and went to the cemetery to visit her daughter's gravesite for the first time. At this point, the burial plot was nothing more than a mound of dirt, but over the course of the next year, Marlys gradually saved up enough money to purchase a headstone with the name Mary Agnes Gross on it. Things took an odd turn 3 months after Mary Agnes's death, when Marlys was mailed an envelope containing a photograph. There was no note or return address, but the photo featured what appeared to be a family consisting of a father, mother, 2 older children, and a newborn baby. When Marlys took a look at the baby's face, she thought it bore a striking resemblance to her ex-husband. She started wondering if the child might be Mary Agnes, who was still alive somewhere, but neither Marlys, her mother, nor anyone else they knew recognized the family. There would be another strange occurrence the following year, when Marlys visited St. Mary's Cemetery and discovered that the headstone she purchased for Mary Agnes had been moved. Instead of being on top of the burial plot, the headstone had inexplicably been shifted a few feet to the side. But in spite of these odd events, Marlys would leave the area and move on with her life. She eventually got remarried and had 3 sons, and while this marriage also ended in divorce, she would permanently settle in Sioux Falls, South Dakota under the name Marlys Thomas in order to raise her boys. Over the next 3 decades, Marlys would periodically return to Minnesota and visit St. Mary's Cemetery in order to pay her respects to Mary Agnes. However, things took a surprising turn during the summer of 1993 when Marlys went to her daughter's gravesite and discovered that an entirely new headstone was there. While Mary Agnes's headstone was still located a few feet away, her actual burial plot now had a headstone resting on top of it with the name Pamela Ray Dickey. To make things even stranger, it also contained the exact same date as Mary Agnes's death, June the 12th, 1962. When Marlys spoke to the cemetery caretaker about this, she was told that the headstone had originally been placed there in 1989. Records showed that a Pamela Ray Dickey was buried in that plot, but there was nothing on file for Mary Agnes Gross. In fact, the caretaker even admitted that he always wondered why Mary Agnes's headstone was placed at that spot, since as far as he knew, no one else besides Pamela Ray Dickey was buried there. When Marlys contacted the Worthington Police Department, she was told there was nothing they could do, so this compelled her to start doing her own investigative work. Even though the cemetery did not have any records for Mary Agnes, Marlys paid a visit to the Benson Funeral Home, and she did find a record there which listed Mary Agnes Gross's burial as taking place at 4 p.m. on June the 13th, 1962, though there was no actual burial permit on file or any documentation about who actually paid for the burial and Mary Agnes's casket. When Marlys started checking records from Worthington Regional Hospital, she uncovered some unsettling discrepancies. Mary Agnes's birth certificate listed her time of birth as 6:23 p.m., and her death certificate listed the time of death as 6:30 p.m., even though Marlys recalled her pediatrician, Dr. John Stamm, telling her that the baby had lived for an hour after being born. Furthermore, the death certificate contained a handwritten note from Dr. Stamm stating that Mary Agnes died at 6:20 p.m., 3 minutes before her time of birth. The death certificate also stated that Mary Agnes died of anoxia, which is an absence of oxygen, and it was signed by Dr. Stamm on June the 14th, 2 days after the child's death. While some hospital records showed that Mary Agnes never even got the chance to take a breath after she was born, other records also showed that F.L. Shada, the doctor who delivered her, gave her an APGAR score of 4 out of 10. In case you're not aware what that is, APGAR is an acronym for Appearance, Pulse, Grimace, Activity, and Respiration. Whenever a baby is born, a doctor will give them a rating in each of these 5 categories on a scale of 0 to 2. While Dr. Shada gave Mary Agnes a 0 in 3 of the categories, he gave her a rating of 2 for her skin color and heart rate, even though it's common for newborns to have a pale skin color and a weak or absent heartbeat if they are unable to breathe. By the time these discoveries were made, Dr. Shada had already passed away, and Dr. Stamm claimed that since so much time had passed, he had very little recollection of these events, though he said, quote, "All I can tell you is that I worked with honest guys. If I certified a baby was dead, that would be on my honor." End quote. Well, believe it or not, it turned out that in addition to Mary Agnes, 2 other female infants were born at Worthington Regional Hospital on June the 12th, 1962, and wound up passing away shortly thereafter. One of the babies was named Julie, who belonged to a couple named Charles and Betty Harriet, but unlike Marlys, they claimed that the hospital let them spend a decent amount of time with their child's body following her death, and they were allowed to take photographs of Julie inside her casket. The other deceased infant? Well, she happened to be Pamela Ray Dickey, the same name on the headstone above Mary Agnes's burial plot. Marlys managed to get in touch with Pamela Ray's mother, Margaret Dickey, who confirmed that she gave birth to her daughter a few hours before Mary Agnes was born, but lost the child the following morning due to lung failure. Margaret described Pamela Ray as having fuzzy, light-colored hair, and she seemed to match the description of the child that Marlys's friend, Judy Voges, had seen in Mary Agnes's casket at the funeral home. But here's where things get really strange. Remember how Marlys's mother, Clara, claimed that she saw an emotional family she didn't recognize at Mary Agnes's gravesite when she was laid to rest? Well, even though Margaret was not well enough to leave the hospital to attend Pamela Ray's funeral, she confirmed that her husband, father, and 4 other daughters were at St. Mary's Cemetery that day in order to bury Pamela Ray in that grave. Furthermore, when Marlys showed Margaret the photographs Clara had taken of what she believed was Mary Agnes's casket, Margaret recognized it and confirmed that her husband had bought that casket for Pamela Ray's burial. So yes, on the surface, it seemed that without even realizing it, both Clara and the Dickey family had simultaneously attended the exact same burial and were each under the impression that they were watching their own child get laid to rest. If things weren't confusing enough, when Marlys looked at Pamela Ray Dickey's funeral records, she found a card which stated that a nurse from Worthington Regional Hospital had called them with information about Pamela Ray's death, but she also noticed that Mary Agnes's last name, Gross, had inexplicably been handwritten in brackets in the card's upper right-hand corner. Marlys asked Margaret Dickey if she would be willing to exhume her daughter's burial plot, but she declined. However, Margaret did say she would consent to Marlys excavating the ground beneath Mary Agnes's headstone a few feet away, as long as Pamela Ray's grave wasn't disturbed. Marlys hired an attorney and spent nearly 2 years in court petitioning for Mary Agnes's gravesite to be dug up before she was finally granted permission. In November of 1996, the ground beneath Mary Agnes's headstone was excavated, and some bone fragments, making up nearly 50% of the skeleton for an infant girl, were found before they were exhumed. Some wood chips were also found, along with the apparent outline of a disintegrated tiny casket in the clay. DNA testing was performed on one of the leg bones and compared with a sample of Marlys's blood. The results showed no genetic connection between them, conclusively establishing that the remains of the deceased child did not belong to Mary Agnes. Margaret Dickey also consented to DNA testing, which also revealed no genetic connection between her and the remains, ruling out the possibility that they belonged to Pamela Ray. So who could this unidentified child have been? Well, that particular section of St. Mary's Cemetery was known as Babyland because a number of deceased infants were buried there. During her visits to Mary Agnes's grave during the 1960s, Marlys did remember seeing some headstones in that section, which were no longer around by the time the gravesite was exhumed in 1996. According to the cemetery caretaker, since records for Babyland were incomplete, the remains could have belonged to an unidentified child who was buried at that spot long before Mary Agnes died. In spite of these new revelations, Margaret would still not consent to exhuming Pamela Ray's gravesite, stating, quote, "She's laid there 34 years without being disturbed, and she's not going to be now," end quote. Marlys suspected that after Mary Agnes was born, individuals from Worthington Regional Hospital conspired to orchestrate some sort of cover-up in order to take her child away and fake her death. Marlys' theory was that the responsible parties were involved in some sort of black market baby selling operation and illegally adopted Mary Agnes out to another family, likely the same family featured in the photograph, which was anonymously mailed to her in 1962. In April of 1998, Marlys appeared on an episode of Unsolved Mysteries in order to share her story, hoping that Mary Agnes might still be alive out there somewhere, completely unaware that she was living under a false identity. But unfortunately, the segment never led to any conclusive answers, and Marlys would pass away in August of 2012 at the age of 70. If Mary Agnes Gross is still alive at the time of this recording, she would be less than 1 month away from turning 58 years old. However, the exact circumstances of what actually happened to her remain unknown. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. So I have to admit that even though I almost consider myself to be an Unsolved Mysteries encyclopedia, this is one case which took me completely off guard when I revisited it a few years ago. When the segment was uploaded to Amazon Prime, I just figured it was going to be your standard lost love story about a mother attempting to reunite with a child who was separated from her a long time ago, but I didn't expect this to become such a bizarre, intriguing mystery. I mean, this whole thing could very well be the result of a colossal screw-up, and Mary Agnes's remains might still be buried somewhere in St. Mary's Cemetery in an unmarked spot. But it's also possible that there was some sort of conspiracy to take Mary Agnes from her birth mother and illegally adopt her out to another family. A good chunk of the lost love cases featured on Unsolved Mysteries wound up being solved, but I think this one was at a tremendous disadvantage because there were no photographs available of Mary Agnes. On numerous occasions, these cases got solved because the right person just happened to be watching the segment on television and were shocked to see an old photograph of someone they recognized on screen. Sometimes, it was the person in the photo recognizing themselves. But that just wasn't an option in this particular case, because Mary Agnes's family was specifically forbidden from taking pictures of her body after she died. The key to this mystery probably would have been the photo that Marlys Thomas received of the unidentified family holding the baby resembling Mary Agnes, but unfortunately, she lost it a long time ago. While the show did produce a reenactment of Marlys receiving the photo, the picture they used during the filming of the scene was not the real one. I can't help but think that if that family portrait had been displayed on national television, somebody would have recognized them. You might be wondering how Marlys could lose something so potentially important, but in the years following Mary Agnes's death, she got remarried and had 3 more kids, and moved around quite a lot, as she spent time living in Washington, California, and South Dakota. So I could see how that photo might go missing during one of those moves. Now, Unsolved Mysteries also aired a couple of lost love stories about black market operations where babies were stolen from their parents after they were born and adopted out to other families for profit. The most infamous example is probably Georgia Tan, who ran the Tennessee Children's Home Society. She was believed to have stolen and adopted out over 5,000 children over the course of 25 years before she died of cancer in 1950. The show also produced a segment about some newborn children who were stolen by a nurse named Ethel Nation, who worked in San Antonio, Texas during the 1950s and 60s, and would often coerce single mothers into giving up their babies so she could sell them on the black market to couples who were unable to have children of their own. And of course, as you might recall, nearly 3 years ago, I released a podcast episode about another missing infant named Mary Agnes. This one involved the disappearance of 2-year-old Mary Agnes Maroney, who was taken from her family in 1930 by a woman who claimed she was representing a social worker. And of course, it's been speculated that this woman might have been involved in a black market adoption ring and sold Mary Agnes to another family. Sadly, these type of operations involving stolen children were not uncommon during the first half of the 20th century, but I have to concede that no one has ever uncovered any evidence to suggest they existed in the Worthington, Minnesota area in 1962. Worthington had a population of just over 9,000 people during that time period, and when Marlys Thomas's attempts to have her daughter's grave exhumed received coverage in the local newspapers during the mid-1990s, a number of local residents offered their comments. They described Worthington as one of those small towns where everybody knew everyone, and they had a hard time believing that multiple people would have been willing to orchestrate a conspiracy to steal a newborn baby away from her mother. I mean, the main reason Georgia Tan was able to keep her operation going for so long was because she stole children away from poor families who could not afford to defend themselves in court, and she also had a prominent local judge in her back pocket who would always rule in her favor. Here, if you believe Mary Agnes Gross was stolen and sold on the black market, the responsible parties actually had to go to the trouble of faking her death in order to prevent her birth mother from searching for her, and this would have required the cooperation of multiple individuals, not just from the hospital, but from the funeral home as well. Now, I don't know what kind of money they would have made from an illegal adoption, but after splitting the cut of the profits among that many people, would it really have been worth their while? All that being said, There's also the possibility that the motive for taking Mary Agnes away from Marlys was not a financial decision, but a moral one. Quite simply, since this was 1962, they may not have believed that the child deserved to be raised by a single mother. There isn't any information out there about Marlys' ex-husband, Leighton Gross, and why their marriage came to an end, but you'd have to think that something went seriously wrong if Marlys decided to separate from him when she was 7 months pregnant. By the time this story started generating headlines during the 1990s, Leighton was already deceased, so we never got to hear his side of the story, but it doesn't sound like Leighton was present when Mary Agnes was born, so I'm not sure how much interest he had in his daughter. Whatever the case, it's no big secret that the world did not have the most progressive attitude towards single mothers in 1962, so if word spread around Worthington that Marlys was planning to raise her child on her own, there may have been some people who believed it was their moral obligation to take Mary Agnes away from her and place the child with a family, and any financial incentive to do this was secondary. One thing about this story which strikes me as particularly strange is that Worthington Regional Hospital had a total of 3 newborn babies die under their care in a span of just over 24 hours. Mary Agnes, Pamela Ray Dickey, and Julie Harriet. I mean, if this happened in a big city, that would be one thing, but that seems like a pretty high infant mortality rate for a hospital in a town of around 9,000 people. There isn't much information out there about Julie Harriet, but what's notable is the contrast between how her parents were treated following her death and how things were handled with Marlys. The Harriets claimed they were allowed to spend some time with their deceased daughter's body and take photographs of her inside her casket, whereas Marlys and her mother were forbidden to take photos at both the hospital and the funeral home, and Marlys pretty much had to beg just to see Mary Agnes's body for 10 to 15 seconds. And while Margaret Dickey never got to see Pamela Ray's body following her death, she claimed that her husband did. The way the Harriets and Dickeys were treated following the loss of their child is exactly how you'd expect someone in their position to be treated, but it sounds like quite a different story with Marlys. During the brief time she did see Mary Agnes, she said it only looked like the child was sleeping, so the implication seems to be that Mary Agnes was still alive at that point, and they were going to great lengths to keep her away from her mother. While that definitely gives off the impression that something shady was happening, the alternate explanation is that sadly, perhaps Marlys was simply treated worse because she was a single mother. The Harriets and the Dickeys may have been given all the time they needed to grieve for their child because they were married couples, but since Marlys was not, the staff may have believed she was not worthy of the same sensitivity. That's an awful mentality, but I could definitely see people feeling that way back then. Julie Harriet is listed on the Find a Grave website, and it appears that she's buried at the same cemetery as Mary Agnes and Pamela Ray, but if her parents were allowed to photograph the child inside her casket and were present at her burial, then I hope that eliminates the possibility of some sort of catastrophic mix-up, and there's no chance that the remains found at Mary Agnes's gravesite belong to Julie. Even if you overlook the hospital staff's rather cold behavior towards Marlys, there are some weird discrepancies in the records about Mary Agnes's birth. A lot has been made about the fact that the doctor who delivered Mary Agnes gave her ratings of 2 on her APGAR score for her skin color and heart rate, even though other paperwork states that the child was not breathing at the time she was born. While those results might seem unlikely if a newborn is unable to breathe, the alternate explanation which has been provided is that Marlys was heavily sedated during the birth, and a baby which is delivered under the effects of anesthesia can give off the initial false impression that their heart rate and skin color are normal. So this could explain the odd inconsistency in Mary Agnes's APGAR score. The more troubling discrepancy are the times listed on her birth and death certificates, which are 6:23 and 6:30 p.m. respectively. If Mary Agnes was unable to breathe when she was born, then it's plausible she could have died 7 minutes later. Yet Marlys' pediatrician, Dr. John Stam, told her that Mary Agnes lived for 1 hour after she was born, and he handwrote 6:20 p.m. as the time of death on the exact same death certificate. Now, if you're looking for an innocent explanation, perhaps Dr. Stam was telling the truth when he said that Mary Agnes was alive for an hour, and he meant to write 7:20 p.m. on the death certificate instead of 6:20. I mean, Stam never actually signed the certificate until June the 14th, 2 days after Mary Agnes was born, so enough time had passed that he could have misremembered things. It is possible that these discrepancies were the result of sloppy clerical errors rather than an intentional cover-up, but the circumstances of Mary Agnes's funeral and burial are what make this story so confusing. So as you recall, Mary Agnes's funeral took place the day after she was born, and Marlys was not well enough to leave the hospital by this point. I think one of the potential sources of confusion is that her mother Clara attended the funeral, and Marlys is only sharing her account secondhand. By the time this story came to light during the 1990s, I believe Clara was already deceased, but if she had been able to provide her own first-hand account of these events, it might answer some questions. Marlys' friend, Judy Bogus, was present alongside Clara when she saw Mary Agnes inside her casket at the funeral home, but the description she provided of the child was much different than how Marlys remembered seeing her daughter at the hospital, particularly when it came to the description of her hair. The implication seems to be that a completely different child besides Mary Agnes was inside that casket, and perhaps that's who the remains, which were unearthed 3 decades later, belonged to. However, since the description Judy provided happened to match Pamela Ray Dickey, the alternate theory is that the child in the casket was her. After all, when Clara took photos of this casket at the cemetery, Pamela Ray's mother, Margaret, later recognized it as the same casket her family had purchased for her daughter's burial. And when this casket was laid to rest, Clara remembered another emotional family being at the gravesite, and Margaret would confirm that her own family was there that day. Therefore, Clara may have actually attended Pamela Ray Dickey's funeral and burial without even realizing it. According to Margaret, her family did not recall seeing Clara at Pamela Ray's gravesite that day, but given that they were not asked about this until over 30 years later, they could have easily forgotten. And the fact that Clara had photos of the casket next to the burial plot does confirm that she was there. But how in the world would these events have played out? Did no one mention either child's name during the entire funeral service? If this wasn't such a horribly tragic situation, you'd almost think this was some wacky misunderstanding from a sitcom, with someone being completely oblivious to the fact that they're attending the wrong funeral. I just can't comprehend this whole situation. If this wasn't a deliberate cover-up to fake Mary Agnes's death, then somebody must have screwed something up big time. So let's try to make sense of this whole situation. When Marlys did her own investigation 3 decades later, she found no records to indicate that Mary Agnes was buried at St. Mary's Cemetery, but she did find a record at Benson Funeral Home that Mary Agnes was scheduled to be buried there on that particular day. There is just no indication of the exact spot where this burial was supposed to take place, but you have to wonder if Mary Agnes really was buried at another location, and Clara mistakenly went to the wrong gravesite where Pamela Ray was being buried. Marlys also found it suspicious that the name Gross just happened to be written on a card in Pamela Ray's funeral records, but this card was apparently filled out after a nurse from the hospital called them with information. If 2 separate deceased infants from the same hospital were scheduled to be handled by the same funeral home on the same day, then I could see someone haphazardly writing Mary Agnes's last name there for future reference without any malicious intent. Since Marlys was still recovering in the hospital at that time, she seems to have no idea who organized this funeral and paid for it, and there's no record of who did so either. But I think there's a good chance that Worthington Regional Hospital took care of everything. Since losing a newborn baby is one of the saddest, most traumatic events a parent can go through, they are often not in the right state of mind to be doing things like arranging a funeral. So therefore, it's not uncommon for hospitals to arrange the funeral and burial of a stillborn child on the parent's behalf, sometimes completely free of charge, and they will often be responsible for the decision-making and the paperwork. Therefore, it would not surprise me at all if the hospital made all the arrangements for Mary Agnes's funeral. And if you believe they were complicit in Mary Agnes's disappearance and orchestrated a cover-up, perhaps they intentionally sent Clara to Pamela Ray Dickey's funeral in order to give her the false impression that Mary Agnes was dead and had been laid to rest. But that seems like an awfully convoluted plan that could have easily fallen apart if Clara had bothered to ask the Dickey family why they were attending her granddaughter's burial. When Marlys visited St. Mary's Cemetery after her release from the hospital and went to Mary Agnes's gravesite, she claimed there was only one fresh mound of dirt there for a burial plot, so of course, she had no reason to believe that Mary Agnes was not buried at that spot. As far as Marlys remembers, she never saw a second burial plot or mound of dirt a few feet away at the spot where the child's remains were eventually exhumed all those years later. Now, when Marlys purchased a headstone for Mary Agnes 1 year later, it was subsequently moved a few feet away from the burial plot, but who knows who actually did that? Since the cemetery records showed that Pamela Ray Dickey was supposed to be buried in that plot, then I can understand why an employee would move a headstone containing somebody else's name. But did they place it at that particular spot because they believed Mary Agnes was buried there, or was it just moved there at random, and it's a complete coincidence that the remains of an entirely different child are beneath it? Unfortunately, by the time Marlys started asking questions, I believe the cemetery had a completely different caretaker than whoever was working there during the 1960s, and this guy had no answers. He even said that he had no idea why that headstone for Mary Agnes Gross was even there in the first place, since her name was not listed in the cemetery records. Since DNA testing proved that the remains which were unearthed did not belong to Mary Agnes or Pamela Ray Dickey, it seems like this caretaker personally believed that they might have belonged to a deceased child who was buried at that spot long before 1962, as records for that particular section of the cemetery were incomplete. So for all we know, those remains could have been buried there in the 19th century. That explanation would make logical sense, and is easier to believe than the idea of someone burying a completely different infant at Mary Agnes's gravesite in order to fake her death. It would also mean that Pamela Ray was buried in her correct grave at the correct time, and the unidentified remains which were found a few feet away have no connection to this story. But if that's the case, then what actually happened to Mary Agnes? If she really did die following her birth, where did her remains wind up? I guess an alternate explanation is that Mary Agnes is actually buried in Pamela Ray's grave, but unless her family consents to exhuming her remains, we will probably never know. I can understand Margaret Dickey's decision not to disturb her daughter's grave, and she has every right to say no. If they did find out that Pamela Ray was not buried there, then I cannot imagine the pain and devastation this would cause. When you look at the big picture, I think you could probably write off most of these oddities as mistakes or clerical errors, and assume that Mary Agnes's remains were lost somewhere, but the one thing which gives me pause is the photograph of the family with the baby, which was anonymously mailed to Marlys 3 months after Mary Agnes's supposed death. Given that she only saw her daughter for a couple of seconds, I'm not sure Marlys could be 100% certain that the child in the photo was Mary Agnes, but if she wasn't, why would someone just mail her a random family picture with no note attached? Marlys pushed forward the theory that perhaps it was the family themselves who sent the photo in order to provide assurance that Mary Agnes was alive and in a loving home, but that seems like a pretty risky thing to do, since there was a possibility of them being recognized. Unless this was just sent by someone who felt like playing a very mean-spirited prank, then the sender could have been an individual who was involved in illegally adopting out Mary Agnes to this family. They may have developed a guilty conscience and wanted Marlys to know that her child was not dead. I guess the wild card is that since she lost this photo, we really only have Marlys's word that it existed, though I don't want to accuse her of making the whole story up. But if the photo was real, it must be noted that Marlys was willing to move on with her life for the next 30 years, And it was only after finding someone else's headstone at what she believed was her daughter's gravesite that she started searching for answers. Even if you believe the official story is true, and Mary Agnes really did die following her birth, that doesn't change the fact that this child no longer seems to have a final resting place. But I can see why Marlys would have felt that a cover-up and an illegal adoption was the best-case scenario, since that would have meant Mary Agnes was still alive and had been raised by another family. That's still a pretty tragic and heartbreaking scenario, but it's still better than the alternative, which is that Mary Agnes died at childbirth, and her remains are buried somewhere, and no one has any clue how to find them. I kind of go back and forth on both scenarios, as there were enough black market adoption rings during this time period for me to believe that something like that could have happened here. But on the other hand, this illegal adoption would have required the collusion of one or more doctors, other hospital staff, and the funeral director, and would that many people have been willing to go along with this? One of the biggest issues with this cover-up is that it seemed to hinge on the coincidental timing of another newborn baby girl dying around the exact same time, which is something they probably could not have anticipated. And even though Pamela Ray Dickey was born a few hours before Mary Agnes, she did not actually pass away until the following morning, and that does not seem like a lot of time to concoct a plan to fake Mary Agnes's death. However, if Mary Agnes really was secretly adopted out to another family, then it's a major tragedy that Marlys passed away without finding out the truth or getting the opportunity to reunite with her daughter. If Mary Agnes is still alive today, then there's a good chance she has no inkling that she was raised under a false identity. Now, I know of a number of cases in which babies have been abducted shortly after their birth by a kidnapper who raised them as their own child. Two fairly recent examples of this were the abductions of Carlina White and Kamaya Mobley, who were both stolen from the hospital shortly after they were born, but as they got older, they became suspicious over the fact that the people who raised them did not have a birth certificate or any legal documentation to prove they were their child. But the key difference is that those children were kidnapped by people who were working entirely on their own, whereas if Mary Agnes was stolen, it would have been done by people connected to the hospital, who likely would have been able to provide her new family with the necessary documentation. If Mary Agnes is still alive, she may be well aware she was adopted by her parents, but is under the mistaken impression that the adoption was legal. What's also interesting is that in the photograph Marlys received, the family had 2 older children in addition to a newborn baby. Maybe this couple reached the point where they wanted another child, but were unable to have any more, which is why they arranged for a black market adoption. And since Marlys was a single mother, the people responsible thought she would be an ideal target. Anyway, all these theories about a black market adoption ring are pure speculation, as no one ever found any evidence that this type of thing was taking place in Worthington during that time period. This whole story may very well just be a case of a terrible tragedy evolving into an unsolved mystery because of bureaucratic incompetence. If there is a resolution to this case someday, it might occur through pure chance. As you well know, anyone can upload their DNA to genealogy websites these days. If Mary Agnes was living under a different identity and decided to upload her DNA to one of these sites, and one of Marlys' surviving relatives decided to do the same thing, who knows? They could very well make an unexpected match someday. I know that people who were adopted have used these websites in order to track down their biological family, so anything is possible. Otherwise, it may be difficult to ever conclusively solve this mystery. All that being said, if you happen to have any information about what happened to Mary Agnes Gross, or perhaps you feel you might be Mary Agnes yourself, please contact the appropriate authorities. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Another reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. We produced a bunch of exclusive bonus episodes for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3, and this past month, we produced an episode about the very first Final Appeal segment ever featured on Unsolved Mysteries, involving the controversial conviction of Glenn Consagra for the double murder of his friends, Freddie Doberly and Mary Lou Holmes. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've also recorded another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries. So to learn more information, feel free to visit our Patreon page. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are David Q, Bree K, Greg A, Michael A, Patrick L, Valerian, Andrea G, and Jill P. Thank you so much for your support. And before I bring this episode to a close, I'd like to play a promo for a new podcast which has a bit of a tie-in to the subject matter of today's episode. Hosted by my friend Erica Kelly from Southern Fried True Crime, the podcast is titled Fetal Abduction. Here's more details.
Pregnancy is an exciting time, full of hope and wonder, and even trepidation. The addition of a child changes a person's life forever. And for victims of fetal abduction in the United States, their lives were brutally changed in a way they could never have imagined. In this series, we will explore cases of fetal abduction in America, from the highly publicized cases to the little known and every case in between. Join me, your host, Erica Kelly, for Fetal Abduction, a true crime podcast. It's a new podcast where we take a closer look at this rare yet heinous crime. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram by searching Fetal Abduction Pod, and subscribe to the show wherever you listen to podcasts.
I also just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, or Spotify. So have yourselves a great week, and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.